Today, we are welcoming two representatives from the Legal Aid Society to talk to us about Housing 101. We have Kensing Ng, who's a staff attorney at Legal Aid Society, and jrSenter, who is also a staff attorney at Legal Aid Society.
Here we go. So I'll be talking to you guys today about tenant rights. I'm Kensing Ng. I'm a staff attorney with the Tenant Defense Unit at the Harlem Community Law Office. My colleague, as was introduced, was jrSenter. He's a staff attorney with the HIV/AIDS Representation Project, also the same office. Just to quickly start on this, so who exactly are we? Who is the Legal Aid Society? Well, we're an organization that provides free legal services to low-income New Yorkers. We have many offices throughout the city. Each borough will have its own LAS office. Sometimes within the borough, there are separate offices for criminal cases or juvenile rights cases and civil cases. Like in Manhattan, we actually have separate ones. So just if you Google like Legal Aid office, you may be sent to a different place. Make sure you're specifying what type of thing you want to, or just hit us up. So who is the Harlem Community Law Office, our law office? We're both staff attorneys there. Jeff works with the HIV/AIDS Representation Project. They focus on addressing the legal needs of people living with HIV and AIDS. And I think, from what I understand, it's a pretty broad group. They do all kinds of different stuff. I'm actually a lot more specific myself. I work in tenant defense, and I specifically work to just stop evictions. So when the landlord is suing a tenant to evict them, I get involved. It's a very singular practice there, so just bear that in mind. So with that in mind, we're going to talk about some of the different types of housing in New York City. There are a great deal of types, but they mostly fall into one of these categories. The first is subsidized housing. These are special buildings where tenants pay rent based on their income. And the second is rent-regulated apartments. They're privately owned, but are subject to rent regulation laws. And those cover two categories of rent stabilized and rent controlled. They're broadly similar, but it's just something to know. Most of the clients that I'm going to see in Manhattan are rent regulated, although other boroughs tend to have less rent regulated and more just market rate apartments. Market rate apartments are not subject to rent regulation. They're neither rent stabilized nor rent controlled, and they're privately owned. Lastly, we want to talk a bit about co-ops. Co-ops, short for cooperative, they're buildings where residents themselves own the buildings. Specifically, the residents have shares in a corporation which owns the building. Anyone who owns a share gets a lease. Now we're going to do a brief overview of the different types of housing. So the first, let's dig into subsidized housing. Most subsidized buildings are owned by the government, such as New York City Housing Authority, but also there's housing projects or public housing. But there are other subsidies such as the Housing and Urban Development, which may or may not be run by the government. Rent in subsidized apartments has to be set to 30% of the tenant's household income. This means that tenants need to regularly submit proof of their income to the administrating body, NYCHA or HUD. It's a process called recertification. Make sure you do that, because if you don't, you can get in trouble. Additionally, once you recertify, you're going to get a lease renewal. Succession is where you sort of inherit an apartment from someone else, and you can succeed to an apartment based on a variety of criteria. The person needs to have been recertifying, and most often, it's important that you've been listed on the lease renewal. However, this can be messy, and it's a complicated process, unfortunately. So that's about that. Lastly, subsidized housing is typically building wide. Not always, but it's typically building wide. So if you're subsidized, chances are your neighbors are too. Not always, but it's a good bet. Next, we're going to talk about rent-regulated apartments. As I said earlier, rent regulation comprises rent-stabilized apartments and rent-controlled apartments. The laws are quite different, but for a tenant, it's going to feel quite similar. In rent-regulated apartments, the rent is overseen by a governmental agency. There's an organization called the Rent Guidelines Board, set by the mayor, and they determine what the rent increases are going to be. When you're in a rent-stabilized apartment, it doesn't mean that the rent won't go up ever. It just means that the amount that it goes up is going to be predetermined year by year. You have a right to a lease renewal in rent-regulated apartment. That means that, when your lease ends, the landlord has to offer you a renewal lease at the increase of rent as previously stated. Succession, like we talked about, is regulated by law. And the way that you determine it is much simpler than the HUD stuff. You simply have to have a close relationship with the person who you're succeeding to, and you have to have been living there for 2 years. Something to note. Let's suppose my son lives with me, but he just moves in 5 months before I leave the apartment. He's not going to get the apartment. Doesn't matter that he's my son. If he's only been there for 5 months with me, he's not going to get the apartment. In a more complicated one, suppose I have a really close friend who lives with me for 10 years. They're not related, but we're really close. We hang out together. We basically hold ourselves out like a family. That's the key thing. If you're acting like your family, that could work. It is a complicated thing to argue in court, but it can be done and has been done. Also, one thing important about rent regulation, each apartment is on its own. Unlike with the HUD subsidy, It is totally possible that just because you're rent regulated doesn't mean your neighbor is rent regulated, and vice versa. So if you're in a building where you say everybody's rent regulated, I must be rent regulated, that's not necessarily true. It is not uncommon for there to be market rate apartments within rent regulated apartments. So let's talk a bit about market rate apartments. Tenants in these apartments have the lease protections. There's no right to lease renewal. There's no restrictions on what the rent can be. There's no succession rights. It's a really unfortunate thing. So if you're in a market rate apartment, it's a risky business. The landlord could, at the end of your lease, simply decide they don't want to rent you anymore and just refuse to give you renewal. Or they could give you renewal where the rent is tripled or quadrupled or whatever. They can give you renewal for $1 million a month. Totally legal. And I mean, because the whole thing is just vague, like if you pass away, your children aren't necessarily going to have rights to the apartment. There's just no laws. Market rent apartments there's very little protections on that. So be aware that if you are in a market rate apartment, there's very little protections for you. Also, much like with rent stabilized, each apartment is on its own. Just because you're market rate doesn't mean your neighbors are. And the same with rent stabilized. In one building, they can be mixed. Lastly, we're going to talk about co-ops and condos. Co-ops and condos, like we said, are run by a board, a corporation with a board. And that corporation is made up of all the shareholders, all of whom get rights to an apartment. They don't have rent because they're technically own that apartment. However, you have to pay maintenance, which includes things like just payments for the building and setup. How much that maintenance is going to be set by the bylaws and can be set by the board. And it's important to note that the way that you get into a co-op and condo is that you have to have shares of ownership that allow you to get a lease. This is a little inaccurate. I should have changed it, but it's not that there's no right. It's that it's defined by the bylaws. Still, that can mean that there may be no right. But just because you had it, your children may not be able to inherit that. I've definitely seen cases where the board said that you cannot just pass your shares on to your next of kin. It has to go through a process, and the board can deny shares to your next of kin. Co-ops and condos are mostly building-wide. You'd think they would be whole building-wide because it's owned by the whole thing, but every now and then we do find, actually quite often, we find co-ops and condos where certain apartments within them might be rent stabilized or even market rate. So just something to be aware about. Just because your neighbors are co-ops and condos doesn't mean that you are. So sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. With that in mind, we're going to move on to housing court itself, which is what I deal with every day. So there's 4 different types of housing court cases. There's non-payments, holdovers, housing part cases, also called HP cases, and illegal lockouts. I'm going to go through all 4 types and briefly explain what they're all about. In a non-payment case, the landlord is suing the tenant because the tenant owes rent. It's important to note that the money that the landlord is suing for must be based on rent that is based on a lease. This means that it cannot include any fees, such as late fees or legal fees. Even if this allows the landlord to collect them, the housing court does not allow you to evict over legal or late fees. One thing to take away from all this is that in a non-payment case, the landlord is suing the tenant to evict the tenant. It's important to note. Next, we'll talk about holdover cases. In a holdover case, the landlord is suing the tenant because of anything that's not rent. These can include things such as the tenant not having a valid lease, or the tenant is a danger to other tenants in the building. In a holdover case, again, the landlord is ultimately suing to evict the tenant. Next, we'll talk about housing part cases, also called HPs, often called HPs. No one really says housing part. In an HP case, the tenant is suing the landlord because of bad conditions in the apartment or because the landlord is harassing the tenant. In an HP case, the tenant is suing the landlord for a court order requiring the landlord to fix the conditions or to stop harassing the tenant. Lastly, we'll talk about illegal lockouts. In a legal lockout case, the tenant is suing the landlord because the landlord had evicted the tenant without a marshal's notice. And that's important to note that you must have a marshal's notice. We'll get to that later, how that is entailed. But if you were evicted by the landlord's friends or random people or anyone who's not a New York City marshal, you should bring in a legal lockout. And if you're successful, you will be allowed back in the apartment. You may need to pay fees and whatnot, but it's all dependent. Next, we're going to talk about one big thing. Most of the cases that we see are non-payment cases, and that's the most common case, people falling behind on their rent. And that can be really tricky. A lot of times people are sort of living paycheck to paycheck, and if you miss a month's rent, it's really hard to get that back. With that in mind, New York City created the one-shot deal. The one-shot deal is a program it's sometimes a no-strings attached grant. It's just free money from the city, but frequently it's a low-interest loan. It's administered by the city, and it's a great way to get large sums of money in the range of tens of thousands of dollars to cover the rent. This is the website where you can access it, or you can just go to any job center, call 301. You can also, they just added this recently, you can go into the court itself. So if you're being sued for non-payment, just head down to the first floor of the court, and you can find the HRA office there. The one-shot deal is really great and is probably the most important thing in New York City for stopping evictions, because it helps people who owe rent get money to pay that rent off. There is still two catches. The first is that you must be able to pay ongoing rent. If you go to HRA and you say, I owe $500, but I cannot pay my rent ongoing, they will not give you any money. If you are able to pay your rent ongoing, they can give you tons of money, but that's really important to know. So one thing I often advise my clients is if you're being sued in non-payment or you think you're going to be sued, you must make sure you have sufficient income to pay your rent. Maybe that means getting more jobs. Maybe that means getting roommates. Maybe that means having a parent or a friend who is willing to help you with the rent. Also, I want to note this is something that we just recently heard that might be changing. For a while, we were told that you have to be a U.S. citizen to get one-shot deals. This may be expanded some time ago where you can actually just be, as long as you have documentation immigration. So that's something that changed somewhat recently from what I understand. Next, we're going to go through what you do if you're confronted with problems. So the first thing that often happens is someone has gotten papers in a court case. One thing to note is that you do not have a court case until you get a petition. And it's going to be something that's going to read on the top right-hand corner of your paper. So say petition, or it'll say notice of petition. Until you have that, there is no case. Usually what happens if you've fallen behind on rent is you're going to get a rent demand, and then you'll get a petition after that. If it's a holdover, you'll either get a notice of termination or notice to quit. None of those three documents, a rent demand, a notice of termination, or notice to quit, means you have a case yet. It means you will soon have a case. So it's just sort of a warning. Especially in the case of a non-payment, that's a warning that you should try to make sure that you have sufficient income to pay your rent going forward so you can get that one-shot deal that we talked about. Especially, you're going to want to gather any documents. If you think the landlord is misrepresenting the amount of money that you owe, or if you believe that the basis of the eviction, if it's, say, not having a lease, if you have a lease, make sure you have those together. Sometimes it can take a while to gather, so you're going to want to take the time to do that while the case has not been brought yet. Because again, until you get a petition, there is no housing court case. So what happens when you do get a petition? Well, if it's a non-payment, you're going to want to file an answer immediately. If you do not file an answer in non-payment, eventually they can get what's called a default, which is where you fail to show up, and then they'll evict you on that. So make sure you file an answer if it's a non-payment. If it's a holdover, they won't ask you to file an answer. They'll just give you a court date. And so the next thing, don't ever miss court. If you can't make it to court for whatever reason, say you fell down a flight of stairs, your leg's broken, whatever, that's a good reason, but you must call the court to let them know. Always keep someone informed. Try to make it to court. If you have a very good reason not to make it to court, call the court ahead of time. One thing to note, you having work, while it is a good reason, I think, the courts don't generally like that. So you should really do everything you can to make it to court. Lastly, you should get a lawyer. And we'll get on to how you can get a lawyer later, but it's really good to have. Housing court and really all courts are very complicated processes. And it's really important to have a lawyer to help walk you through some of the legalese and the language there. So in terms of getting a lawyer, I want to talk a bit about this program called Universal Access, also called Right to Counsel, but we prefer Universal Access. The deal with Universal Access is that when you come to court on that first time, you'll be connected to a legal services provider. That's someone like us, Legal Aid Society. It is worth noting there's many different groups. There's Legal Aid Society, New York Legal Assistance Group. We all do kind of the same thing, but we have different names. So something just to note. One thing I also want to note on this is that it says connected to a legal service provider. This does not guarantee a lawyer. This just means that we will be connected with you, and we will either give advice or will represent if we can. But that's important to note that part of the reason why they didn't call it right to counsel is because there is not a right to counsel. There's a right to access. It's a right to talking to a lawyer. Oftentimes, if you're low income, we'll be able to represent you, but just no guarantees. Particularly these days, I mean, not to get off on tangent, but like, wow, there are a lot of cases with not enough lawyers. So there are big issues with capacity. I just say that to sort of set everyone's expectations. There is no guarantee of a lawyer, but at the very least, you get advice on what to do. Now, a while back, I mentioned marshal's notices. That's a separate thing. What if you get a marshal's notice? That is urgent. If you get a marshal's notice, you must deal with it. You cannot wait. You cannot ignore it. A marshal's notice means that eviction is coming. And what you need to do is you need to go to court. One thing I tell all my clients is if you get a marshal's notice, it does not matter if I said it's okay, or if the landlord said it's okay, or the judge said it's okay, or President Biden himself said it's okay. A marshal's notice means an eviction is coming regardless of what anyone else has said. You must immediately go to court or contact your lawyer and have them go to court to stop the eviction. That can be as easy as saying, President Biden said there's no evictions, and that'll work. But you must go to court to do that. Because if you don't, they're just going to go ahead with the eviction. Next, what happens if you've just been evicted? This might be because you missed the marshal's notice or because, like I said, an illegal eviction. Either way, the response is to go to court. You can go to court and you can explain that you were evicted you were maybe evicted illegally, or if it was legal, there should be a housing case. And what you can do is you can say, I would like to go and resolve whatever the issue is. It can be difficult once you've been evicted through a legal housing case to deal with it, but it can be done, and it's worth going to court. It's also important to go to court really quickly, because when you're evicted, chances are the landlord is going to want to re-rent the apartment. If your apartment is rented out to someone else, there's not much the court can do. The court is not going to kick out a new tenant to put you back in. So if you are illegally evicted, or this is something you can easily resolve because it's an issue of money, you need to go to court immediately so you can say, don't re-rent the apartment. I will resolve whatever this issue is. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about the issues of the housing part cases, the HP cases. So this is where a landlord is not complying with their responsibilities to maintain a good apartment. This is what's called a breach of the warranty of habitability. The warranty of habitability is basically a promise. The landlord rented you an apartment, it's got to be a livable apartment. You have a right to a safe, decent, habitable apartment because you're paying rent. And if it is not safe, decent, habitable, then the landlord has breached that warranty, that promise that they were going to give you a habitable apartment. A couple of things to note, these include issues such as mold, vermin. A lot of times I have tenants who have issues with like rats or roaches, and they think it's their fault. What I want to note is that from the court's perspective, it is always the landlord's responsibility to repair this. I'm not saying leave food everywhere. Yes, that will attract rats and roaches. However, if there are rats and roaches, it is the landlord's responsibility to deal with them. So that's something that will be included in the warranty habitability. Additionally, you can have housing part cases where there's harassment. And harassment is anything where the landlord is treating the tenant poorly with the goal of pressuring the tenant to vacate or to give their rights. That's the essence of harassment. The landlord is trying to scare you to get you out. Know that this doesn't necessarily mean that, if you owe money and you get a rent demand, yeah, that's legal. But if the landlord is coming by every week to sort of tell you you've got to get out because you owe the money, that could be harassment. So what to do if you've got any of these problems? How do you report them? Well, first, you have to notify the landlord. You have to tell the landlord, listen, there's mice, there's roaches, there's a leak, there's whatever. This is important because the landlord needs to know about it in order to be put on the hook for it. If you don't like being called every week, tell the landlord you don't like it. Assuming the landlord doesn't stop, and they usually don't stop, then you can call 301 to report it. 301 is Housing Preservation and Development. They are the ones who are going to be able to make a record of this and make sure that you are able to legally have these things recorded, that whatever the problems the landlords have been doing will be recorded. It is worth noting that if you live in NYCHA, HPD will not be able to issue the housing code violations for that. All right. Next, we're going to talk about what to do when you want to sue your landlord in a housing part action. Once you've filed the complaints with 301 and you have that record, you can then file a housing part action. To do that, you can go in person to your local housing court clerk, or you can just file it online via a program called NYSIS. Now, that can be complicated and requires you to have access to a computer and to kind of know what you're doing. I strongly recommend going to a local housing court clerk. They will walk you through the process. Lastly, I just want to talk about some other resources for this. First, if you have any questions about housing or anything, you can just call the housing hotline. They're a great resource and they can always give you advice on what to do in any sort of housing situation. Manhattan Housing Court's number is this number. And here's our information, the Legally SMARTUEast Harlem Community Law Office. That's our main office number. And here's our website below. And that's been it. So again, here's our address. Here's my information and Mr. Center's information. So thank you so much for listening. And yeah, feel free to contact me with any other issues. Email is the best way.
I'm going to talk more about supportive housing specifically. Supportive housing is not one thing, it's a category. First, I'll mention Kensing works specifically on tenant defense measures in Manhattan. I work on the Legal Aid Society's HIV/AIDS representation project. It's a small unit. We work with low and middle income people throughout the 5 boroughs of New York City. To sort of contact us, the Warmline 718-579-8989 is up. You call, leave a message, and we call you back. So that's sort of how our intake works. And we handle civil issues. We don't do immigration ourselves, but we do a lot of other stuff in terms of beyond housing. We do a lot of benefits work, Social Security, food stamps, health insurance, consumer debt, this, that, and the other in terms of the topics that we deal with. So supportive housing, we could talk for days nonstop, weeks nonstop about the many details of housing in New York City and supportive housing in New York City. So we'll try and be brief and touch on important areas. One thing just to keep in mind, I remind clients often as a general orientation is landlords are in the business of making money, and there is essentially no other reason for what they do. Private landlords, the job is to make money. However they can, they will do so. supportive housing is, in theory, supposed to be different in that they're run by nonprofit organizations that have government contracts to provide housing with some sort of services. In practice, it varies. There are many, many different supportive housing providers, and some of them are, pretty good, and some of them you're like, boy, this is like the slumlord that I just came from. So there is a tremendous amount of variation, and we've had a lot of litigation with supportive housing providers over, it's like, why does my apartment flood every time it rains? That doesn't seem right. Things like that. Another thing that I'll mention is that for the population living with HIV/AIDS, how the city as a supportive apparatus is most folks go to job centers to deal with the Department of Social Services, Human Resources Administration. They're called, job centers are now called benefits access centers. They just changed the name. For people living with HIV/AIDS, they have a parallel administration called HASA. And HASA is the offices, the centers that work specifically with people living with HIV/AIDS. They have special programs and special laws about how they're supposed to have individualized caseworkers and a certain ratio. So that sounds great. The reality is they're having tremendous amount of difficulty at HASA right now. And they're very, very understaffed. They are trying to hire 100 plus new people. So if you have a bachelor's degree and you would like to work for the city of New York, they're hiring at HASA. That's basically all you need is a bachelor's degree and you get in the door. They have suspended basically or put off the civil service examination requirement because they're so desperate for people. So if you want a job, they really are hiring, starting at 41,000, and it's going to, with a new contract, it's going to go up. But the flip side of that is they don't have the top and most trained workers right now. They have far too few staff and are having trouble attracting people. So in sum, working with HASA may be necessary, but also very frustrating, very frequently. Now, within supportive housing, you have a vast array of different government organizations and nonprofits. It can be an alphabet soup very easily. There are two different broad types of supportive housing that I think of as sort of structural categories. You have scatter site supportive housing, where people live in individual apartments that are rented by a nonprofit organization. Those are typically a private apartment in a private building of some sort that ABC nonprofit has rented and placed either one person or often two people who don't even know each other together into this apartment. That's scatter site housing. The other type as a category is congregate housing or congregate care. That is where the nonprofit controls typically a whole building or some selection of floors of the building. And the entirety of that building, it has people who are placed in it from the supportive housing population. Now, the idea of supportive housing for both congregate and scatter site is that people with certain forms of disabilities or needs have both housing and forms of support tied to the housing and managed by the nonprofit. There's supportive housing for veterans. There's supportive housing for people living with HIV/AIDS. There's supportive housing for people with substance use histories. There's supportive housing for people with developmental disabilities. There's a lot of supportive housing for people with mental health challenges. There's all these different types of supportive housing, and it can be very difficult to figure out what type you're in. If you are in supportive housing, it can be difficult to figure out who's doing what. These are not made as clear as they're supposed to. HASA, the HIV/AIDS Services Administration from the city of New York, which is part of the Human Resources Administration, which is part of the Department of Social Services, which is part of the city of New York. HASA has a lot of supportive housing, but there are many other city and state government entities that also have supportive housing. New York City has the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and also New York City Housing Preservation and Development. They have supportive housing. New York State has the Office of Mental Health. HUD also has supportive housing. And each of these are different in their rules, in their details, and also some differences in how you get in. The way to get into supportive housing is different than you would have with a regular apartment, where you would apply as for a rent stabilized apartment or for a market rate apartment, or even if you were to try and get a subsidized apartment through either applying yourself through New York City Housing Authority to get, you can be number 250,000 person in the line, perhaps, or you can try the HPD housing choice lotteries, where it's maybe a 1 in 100 shot. People do get into those. All of those you are applying yourself as an applicant. For supportive housing, someone else is applying for you, as the way it's set up in New York. So for HASA, supportive housing, you're going through the HASA process, and it involves HASA staff that are doing part of it. Part of the process involves HASA staff. For other supportive housing in New York City, a lot of it involves some caseworker or social worker at some sort of social services organization doing what's called an HRA 2010E form, 2010E. And that is the application form that certain people have access to put in an application. Those are the two main application processes. In both cases, you as an individual are not the one doing the application. It is a very messy process and not a very good process in New York City getting into supportive housing. There are many challenges, hurdles, and inefficiencies, but New York City has a tremendous amount of supportive housing. The idea with supportive housing is that there are services support. Supportive means support with the housing, support and housing, supportive housing. The practice varies a lot. Some places and some organizations do provide a bit of services with the supportive housing. Others, it just doesn't exist. It's supposed to exist, but in practice, you will see a person possibly once a year. So it is not something that you can count on as having supports with supportive housing. Generally speaking, the congregate care or congregate version of supportive housing, where everybody is in one building together, will have staff on site and will have more services, but the quality varies a lot. There are some places that do a good job and some places that do not. So they may be providing assistance, or they may be a source of frustration, mostly for the residents. And this is a big problem. So you have all these different government organizations and all these different providers. First, the question is, well, what is your provider? You might have a provider with a pretty good reputation, such as Housing Works, or you might have a provider with not a very good reputation. In either case, things may go well or things may not go well based on their performance rather than factors that are as in control. People, where possible, may prefer to have independent housing just to not have the burden of dealing with the supportive housing. But some people need the supports. This is more true for congregate housing than it is for scatter site housing. Scatter site housing is supposed to provide supports, and in some cases does. One of the fundamental supports is it finds you an apartment, which can be very difficult. For people living with HIV/AIDS who meet the income qualifications, which are complicated, HASA also may provide the equivalent of a subsidy that is sort of like 30% of your income. And that, even though that subsidy is very valuable and can support apartments now up to, for a 1-bedroom, around $2,200, which does exist, it can be very hard to find those apartments due to housing discrimination based on how your income is. You have a subsidy from HASA. Because of this, some people who might be able to live without supportive housing are in scatter site supportive housing because that's how they get an apartment. That's how they find it. Now, like I said, there are many, many different nonprofits that run supportive housing or residences or scatter site programs. They're supposed to, particularly this is now specifically required and emphasized by the HASA, provide people with a notice of tenant rights and a notice that says, okay, here are the equivalent of a lease, either a lease with the details or the equivalent of the release that says, among other things, what share, if any, of the rent you owe and what other rights you have. In practice, people often don't get those. It can make it very difficult to know if there are rules, if there are requirements. Oftentimes, you are required to resubmit your financial stuff once a year, but there can be differences tremendously. So that is a broad overview. And beyond that, it's a little bit tough to get into the details because it varies a lot from place to place within supportive housing.